I sat in my chair by the window, quietly sipping my coffee while gazing at the marigolds blooming in my garden. This autumn feels unusually chilly. Here in suburban Minnesota, mornings are already touched with glistening frost. I'm Beverly Anderson, a retired elementary school teacher who dedicated 30 years to the profession before stepping down 3 years ago. Now at 63, my only worry is my daughter, Emily. 7 years ago, Emily married Michael Walker, the owner of Walker's Electronics, a local appliance store. These days, she juggles a part-time office job while raising her son, Tommy. Tommy has always been a bright and energetic 7-year-old boy, at least until recently. Over the past few weeks, something about him has begun to change. In the early days of their marriage, Michael was a wonderful husband and father. The store was doing well, and he was known in the community as a promising young businessman. Lately, though, that warm smile of his has become increasingly rare. Michael's mother, Helen, a former nurse, lived quite comfortably and had even helped with the couple's mortgage. Initially, I thought of her as someone who understood us, an ally. Outside my window, red maple leaves are dancing to the ground. Halloween is next week. Houses along the street have already started displaying their jack-o'-lanterns. Who could have imagined that in this peaceful neighborhood, such an incident would unfold? I'm coming to your place with Tommy. Don't worry. That Sunday morning, I kept rereading Emily's message as I paused my gardening. The autumn air stung my skin. Maple leaves drifted onto the marigold bed I just tended. What should have been a peaceful Sunday morning had set off alarm bells in my heart. Something was off about my daughter's message. Emily would always call, not text. As I pulled off my gardening gloves, I quickly sent a reply. Are you home right now? No response. In the distance, church bells rang 9 times. The sound of Sunday service beginning seemed unusually ominous this morning. I watched families walking down the street, and the sight of a young boy holding his father's hand reminded me of Tommy. Come to think of it, the strange events had started on Thursday. During our usual meetup at Caribou Coffee, Emily had seemed different. Sitting by the window, fidgeting with her latte, she'd started hesitantly. Mom, I need to talk to you. Her voice lacked its usual brightness. Emily kept fidgeting with her fingers as she carefully chose her words. The sound of the barista grinding coffee beans echoed through the cafe. Usually a comforting background noise, today it felt jarring. Michael's been acting strange lately. The store isn't doing well. He says they're losing customers to online shops. Her hands were trembling slightly. When I reached out to touch them, she gently pulled away. But that's not all. Helen's been coming to our house almost every day. She lowered her voice. She seems to disapprove of everything, my cooking, my cleaning, how I'm raising Tommy. And Michael just agrees with everything she says. Just then, Emily's phone rang. Helen's name appeared on the screen. She hurriedly answered and stood up. I need to take Tommy to his activities. I'm sorry. The coffee cup was still half full. On the surface of the abandoned latte, anxious swirls remained. I never imagined that would be our last normal conversation. The next day, I received a call from Mrs. Smith, Tommy's teacher at Lincoln Elementary School. "Mrs. Anderson, Tommy hasn't been to school all week. I've been trying to contact Mrs. Walker." Worry seeped through her voice. "I've been concerned about Tommy lately. His drawings during art time have become somewhat dark." As I processed this disturbing news, another call came in. It was Helen. "Beverly, there's no need for concern. Tommy needs proper discipline right now. It's part of his home education." Helen's voice on the other end was unnaturally cheerful. Before I could respond, she continued, "Children these days are too coddled. Things were different in our time. Discipline and manners are essential." Michael agrees with me. That night, I called Emily repeatedly. There was no answer, and I could only leave voicemail messages. My anxiety continued into the next day. When I called Walker's Electronics on Saturday afternoon, Michael answered. "Oh, mother-in-law. Emily said she was going to your house. Something about an urgent matter." There was something off about his voice. It seemed strained. If she were coming to my house, she would have definitely called me. Plus, I was worried about Tommy missing school. In the evening, I received a call from Mrs. Peterson next door. "I heard noises from the Walker house last night," her voice trembled. "It sounded like someone was screaming. We wondered if we should call the police. But Helen said it was a family matter." And then came Sunday morning. The sudden message. My daughter's silence. I grabbed my car keys. It was a 10-minute drive to the Walker house. As I drove under the autumn-colored trees, I gripped the steering wheel with a prayer in my heart. At the intersection, the light turned red. During that pause, the anxiety in my chest continued to grow. Standing at their front door, I sensed an eerie silence. An unfamiliar large truck was parked in their two-car garage. Perhaps for transporting display appliances. I rang the doorbell, but there was no response. "Emily. Tommy." When I gently pushed the door, it wasn't locked. The living room was empty. The kitchen too. The air felt frozen. Then I heard a faint sound. There was a large refrigerator placed in an unusual spot behind the kitchen. And from inside came a voice, "Grandma." My spine turned to ice. There was no mistaking Tommy's voice. As I stood frozen in front of the refrigerator, I heard the faint voice again. "Grandma, open it." The voice was trembling. It sounded thin, as if coming through ice. My hands shook. When I touched the door of the large refrigerator, the metal's coldness stung my fingertips. It must be a new display model. Walker's Electronics logo gleamed impersonally. I took a deep breath and slowly opened the door. Freezing air escaped from inside. In the bluish light of the interior lamp, two figures were huddled together. Tommy reached out to me, shivering. His small body in pajamas was trembling violently. Beside him, Emily sat exhausted. Her thin house clothes were inadequate against the cold, and her lips had turned purple. The interior thermometer showed 35 degrees Fahrenheit. "It's okay, I'll get you out right now." Just as I reached for Tommy, Emily's eyes widened and she let out a small scream. "Mom, behind you." I sensed someone's presence. When I turned around, I saw Michael. Though he wore his familiar navy cardigan, he looked like a different person. His usually gentle eyes were now vacant and wide. "Mother-in-law," a sinister smile crossed his lips. "You're interrupting an important lesson." His voice had completely lost its former warmth. It sounded mechanical, as if someone else were controlling him. The morning sun streaming through the entrance cast unnatural shadows on his face. His hands trembled, making the hem of his cardigan quiver. "Michael, why? Why?" He tilted his head. "Are you criticizing parents who care about their children's education? Isn't that what you believe in too?" Just then, footsteps echoed down the stairs. Click-clack, click-clack, as regular as a ticking clock. Helen appeared. Her pearl necklace gleaming, she approached with elegant poise, as if arriving for a Sunday morning tea party. "Ah, Beverly," she smiled. Beneath her perfect makeup, only her eyes showed an unusual glint. "I apologize for the early hour. But this is necessary educational guidance. As a nurse and a mother, I'm only doing what's best." I desperately tried to shield Emily and Tommy in the refrigerator with my body. Helen's gaze was cold as ice. Her eyes held an abnormal certainty. "Sometimes strictness is necessary in child rearing," she continued in a tone like she was lecturing a teacher. There was something almost intoxicated in her voice. "Emily lately has been lacking awareness as a housewife. Tommy's meals are irregular, his homework isn't properly monitored. Right, Michael?" Michael nodded mechanically, like a puppet controlled by his mother. "Since yesterday evening," Emily began with a trembling voice. "They've kept us in here." Silence. Helen's voice cut sharply through the air. Her cheeks twitched beneath her makeup. "Don't you understand? This is for your own good. For Michael's good. For this family's good." I slowly took my smartphone from my pocket. The numbers 911 seemed to pulse like a heartbeat on the screen. My finger trembled as it moved toward the emergency call button. "Don't move." Suddenly, Michael was holding a kitchen knife. The blade gleamed in the morning sun. His hand was shaking too. His eyes swirled with fear and confusion. "Put the phone down," his voice resonated low. "Like Mother says, this is a family matter." In the refrigerator, Tommy let out a sob. That sound triggered memories to flash through my mind, holding Tommy for the first time, Emily's wedding, Michael's smiling face as he helped customers in his store, and how they had gradually changed. The trembling small body. My daughter's pale face. Michael's vacant eyes. Helen's eerie smile. None of it seemed real. The cold air leaking from the refrigerator seemed to envelope this abnormal scene. I took a deep breath. The composure I'd developed over 30 years of teaching slowly returned. My experience handling student crises was becoming a source of strength. Indeed, I carefully chose my words. This is a family matter. While appearing to show my phone, I touched the screen. But instead of dialing, I pressed the record button. The red recording light blinked like a beacon of hope. That's exactly why we should keep a record, shouldn't we? Let's let the police hear your educational theory. Helen's expression hardened. Her face contorted beneath her perfect makeup. I'm calling the police now. I deliberately showed my smartphone. But first, Michael, put down the knife. You were a good father, weren't you? It's not too late. You don't have to obey your mother. Michael. Just as Helen reached for her son's arm, a siren wailed in the distance, getting closer. Mrs. Peterson had been in her garden when I drove out. She must have called the police after watching me leave with that worried expression. The police. The knife fell from Michael's hand. The sound shattered the frozen time. The fallen knife still quivered on the floor. In sync with its movement, the siren grew louder. What would the police understand? Helen's voice was cold as ice. About this family, about our educational principles. Her words were cut off by the sound of police car brakes. Car doors opening and closing. Multiple footsteps running toward the entrance. Open up. Police. Strong knocking echoed. Michael stared at the entrance, then looked up at Helen's face. His expression was anxious, like a small child. Helen moved quickly toward the kitchen. The sound of a drawer opening. Metal gleamed in the morning sun. Nobody move. She held another knife in her hand. The blade glinted in the morning light. I instinctively stood between her and Emily and Tommy. The cold from the refrigerator froze my back. Helen, stop, my voice trembled. That's enough. Enough? She gave a sad smile. We haven't even begun. These children's education is just getting started. At that moment, the front door burst open with a loud bang, and several officers entered the living room with guns drawn. Detective O'Brien, our local officer, assessed the situation in an instant and called out to Helen. Mrs. Helen Walker, put that knife on the floor. This is a family matter. Helen gripped the knife tighter, slowly backing away. Tommy's sobs echoed. The next moment, as Helen tried to lunge toward us, the officers quickly subdued her, and the knife clattered to the floor. Helen Walker, you're under arrest. The sound of handcuffs clicking. Another officer was guiding Michael to the wall. He followed submissively, like a puppet with cut strings. Get the paramedics in here. At Detective O'Brien's command, paramedics rushed in. Orange blankets were gently draped over Emily and Tommy. It's all right, I embraced Tommy's shivering body. You're safe now. Outside the window, police lights were flashing. Neighbors were gathering in small groups. I spotted Mrs. Peterson among them and gave her a small nod. She returned the gesture with tears in her eyes. Mrs. Anderson, a paramedic, approached me. They both show signs of mild hypothermia. We'd recommend a hospital examination just to be safe. Emily gripped my hand from the stretcher. Her fingers were still cold. Mom. I'm sorry. I should have told you sooner. It's okay, I squeezed her hand gently. You did nothing wrong. I watched as the paramedics carried Emily and Tommy to the ambulance. As I turned back, I caught one last glimpse. Helen was still shouting something as she was placed in a separate police car. Beside her, Michael trembled silently, head bowed. Mrs. Anderson, Detective O'Brien approached. Your quick thinking prevented a major tragedy. The recording will be crucial evidence. I nodded silently, feeling a lump in my throat. The morning sun had risen high in the sky. Autumn leaves swayed in the breeze. Somewhere, church bells rang, marking the end of Sunday service. A neighbor's jack-o'-lantern cast strange shadows in the morning light. Halloween was next week. But for this family, perhaps the real nightmare was finally ending. I took a deep breath. A long journey was beginning. But hope was visible on the horizon. The ambulance siren echoed through the quiet neighborhood. 1 week after the incident, I sat in the waiting room at St. Mary's Hospital, waiting for visiting hours. Outside the window, maple leaves were falling. Mrs. Anderson. I turned to find Dr. Thompson standing there. Emily and Tommy are progressing well. While they'll need professional care for the trauma. I nodded slightly at her words. Just yesterday, I'd received a detailed report from the police. Helen Walker's past was gradually coming to light. 10 years ago, she had suddenly resigned from her hospital position. The reason, excessive intervention with patients, particularly her educational guidance of young mothers. Afterward, she had satisfied her desires by perfectly controlling her son Michael. Beverly. Michael walked down the hallway. Just released on bail after questioning in detention, he no longer had that vacant look, but rather showed deep remorse. May I? His voice trembled. May I see Emily and Tommy? Just then, the counseling room door opened. Mrs. Lewis, their counselor, smiled warmly. Perfect timing. Tommy's been asking to see his daddy. Inside, Tommy was playing with building blocks. Emily sat quietly reading a book nearby. Tears welled up in Michael's eyes at the sight of his son. Daddy. Tommy ran to his father without hesitation. Michael embraced his small body, repeatedly apologizing. Emily closed her book, watching them quietly. It will take time, she said slowly. But I want to rebuild our family. Mrs. Lewis gently intervened. There's no need to rush. Let's start with regular visits in a safe environment. True to her words, the family's healing progressed gradually. A month later, Emily and Tommy moved to a protective facility. Walker's Electronics temporarily closed, but the local business association offered support. Every Tuesday, we attend family counseling. According to Mrs. Lewis, Michael's liberation from control is progressing well. His mother Helen was committed to a psychiatric ward. The initial evaluation revealed serious controlling tendencies and perfectionism. Grandma, look. 6 months later, at his birthday party in their new apartment, Tommy proudly showed me his drawing. The dark colors were gone, replaced by bright, vibrant hues across the paper. That's beautiful, I stroked my grandson's head. What is it? This is our new home, and this is the church, and this is Daddy's store. Tommy explained excitedly. And this is. His words were interrupted by the doorbell. It was Mrs. Peterson, bringing a homemade hot dish for the celebration. Behind her stood members of the church volunteer group. The community's support has been amazing, Emily told me in the kitchen. Everyone just being there, without saying anything. Mom! Tommy came running. Dad's here. Michael was now allowed to see his son only on weekends. In his hands was a small birthday present, a carefully chosen picture book. It will still take time, Mrs. Lewis had told us recently. But you're all moving in the right direction. In the living room, Tommy's birthday song was playing. Candlelight warmly illuminated the faces of everyone gathered. The aroma of Mrs. Peterson's casserole filled the room. Outside the window, the street trees were preparing for winter. Next spring, new buds would sprout again. Our family too was slowly but surely moving toward a new season. There's no such thing as a perfect family. What matters is having hearts that care for each other, and the courage to ask for help when needed. Perhaps that small voice I heard from the refrigerator that morning was teaching us just that. I quietly closed my eyes. From the living room came the sound of Tommy's laughter. It rang out like the bells of hope.